I'd like now to talk about the deer that were at Mount White in the early days. In 1908, a group of people, sports people in Christchurch, had a bit of a yarn about importing some deer from England to liberate, and at their own will or desire to be able to go up there and blow a deer or two over every now and again. So they negotiated with a big deer farm in England, and eventually about 8 or 9 hinds were purchased along with 2 big stags, and they were shipped out to New Zealand in October of 1908. They arrived at Littleton and they were put on the railway straight away. They didn't go into quarantine or anything. I suppose in those days they didn't know anything about quarantine, but they were put on the rail and they were railed up to what they called the Broken Hill siding, which I think is round about Avoca or Craigieburn, somewhere round about there. Now, on the way out from England, 2 of these hinds died, and I suppose they chucked them overboard, or the sailors might have eaten them, I don't know. And also, when they were being transshipped from Christchurch up to the Broken River siding, another hind died. So I think all in all was about 7 deer arrived at the siding. So the Mount White wool wagons went over the Waimak River and to pick the deer up out of the big deer crates that arrived in from England. From there they were shipped back or transported back over the Waimak River and 2 or 3 kilometres up the Polter River for liberation. When the deer were taken out of the deer crates, they just stood there. They didn't know what to do, they didn't run away, and you can understand that because they've been boxed up in these crates all the way from England across the seas and come out here and they've been hand-fed, and so these old deer just stood there and so eventually they wandered off and up the valley they went and so forth. Now, those deer went up there and they had a royal time. You can imagine what the deer felt like coming from England, and oh, here's a beautiful valley, big rivers, river flats, bush, all the gears, lovely. And so the deer went up and multiplied and multiplied and multiplied. And then it was discovered that the deer had become a nuisance because the deer were eating what stock could eat, cattle could eat up the Polter. And so the government decreed in 1933 that these were noxious animals and that they had to go because they just had to go. So then the culling of the deer started and the shooting of the deer started after 1930, around about in the 30s and 30s, the mid-30s. And up until, for 30 years, up to about in the middle 1960s, it was estimated that there were 40,000 deer shot off the upper Waimakariri Basin, which included all of the Polter Valley and all of the land that's taken up by the Mount White Run. And that's a huge amount of deer when you come to think about it. From the 1960s onwards, or prior to the 1960s, the government employed deer cullers to go onto those stations, particularly Mount White. And the deer cullers could go to Mount White, 2, perhaps 3, perhaps 4, and they would shoot 1,000 or 1,500 deer each in the season from about November till the end of May. And so the deer, although they look lovely and they think that they're, you know, nice to see the deer up in the back country and all this, which it is, but the time comes they're like rabbits. They're nice to see 1 or 2 of them, but when you get thousands and thousands eating out of house and home, well then you've got to do something about it. And so the government did, and we all know the story about helicopters and the exporting of venison and so forth and so on. And so the old deer, he had his day, and I don't know whether they'll ever come back or not, but one of the ironical things about the deer that were liberated at Mount White, all 1908, is that today on Mount White, There's a huge big deer farm, and they actually run deer there as an enterprise, and you know, that's how things work. Yeah. I've spoken previously about the deer that were imported into New Zealand in 1908. And as I explained, the deer were railed up to the Broken River siding, and from there they were taken across to Mount White in the big bull wagons in the crates that the deer were shipped in from England. They were lovely big crates, and some of them were, parts of them were still at Mount White when I was there, and the deer were brought across the Waimakariri River with the horse and the wagon, and they were taken up the Polter, and there the crates were slid off the wagons, as you can see in this next photograph of, I don't know, they've had some 6x1s or big poles that they'd cut out of the bush or something. And the deer were then liberated out of the crates, and here they are shown just standing there quietly, not a worry in the world, big trip from England, standing on terra firma. And in the background, the man standing in the background is a Mr. Saville. Now Mr. Saville owned Mount White from about 1902 till about 1912. And Mr. Saville is a well-known man in the backcountry of New Zealand. He left Mount White in 1912, and he purchased a big area in North Canterbury called St Helens. This is a picture of a nice, big, stately stag that my brother Ron stalked out at Anderson's at the back of Mount White. It took him about two and a half hours to creep up on this big fellow, and at the very last moment he stood up and went click with the camera, and that's the result. It's a very, very nice picture. Here we have one of the shooters at Mount White, lucky enough to fire a bit of lead at one of the stags at Bottom Packety, and that's the result. One or two more skins here on the hitching rail at Nigger Hill, and they were always a supplement to the musterers' wages, where you could shoot the skins, sell them to the skin buyer, and get a few extra quid that way. Finally, this is one of the little deer colours that were employed by the Forest Service in the 50s and 60s to eradicate the deer at Mount White. Not a very big fellow, but a very tough little rooster. Yeah. Just a word or two about the cattle that were at Mount White when I was there. They had about 500 or 600 head of good Hereford cattle. And these cattle used to graze up the Polter and up the Esk and out at Riversdale around the Waimakariri River flats. This country suited cattle because it was in place swampy and it was low down, and cattle couldn't get in much trouble. And so the cattle that were there didn't take a lot of looking after, really. There was only the marking of the calves each year, marking them by way of castrating the bull calves and putting a mark in their ear to know who owned who. And these calves were then, some of them, the steer calves, were sent away to Addington to be sold at Addington. Replacements were kept, and the other cattle that were there were kept for a longer period than that, till they got a bit mature. That's 18 months old, rising 2-year-olds and stuff like that. And they were sent away to Addington for sale. They had big Hereford bulls at Mount White. It was reasonably tame and stuff, but you didn't get too close to them. And when the cattle were due to be shipped or sent away from Mount White, the way it was done was that the cattle were mustered in from up the Polter and up the Esk, and they were sorted out. And all breeding cows on one side and the bulls and the bits and pieces the other. Those that were for sale were driven out on the White Road, about 16 miles out to Riversdale. And there they were put in the sheep yard, in the cattle yards, and when the opportunity arose and the Waimakere River wasn't perhaps a lot of water in it, you checked to see when the train was coming on the main trunk line. These musters then would let the cattle out of the yards and they would drive them over to the banks of the Waimak and punch them into the Waimak River, swim them across if it was necessary. But mainly the water would be up to about halfway up the cattle beast, and they'd get out the other side and get them over the railway line and head them towards the Cass Stream. They come into the Cass Stream, they could sort of corral them up and keep them pretty much confined there, and they would drive them right away up the Cass Stream to the Cass railway station, where there were big, strong cattle yards where they were put into, and railway wagons which had been pre-ordered would be there, or they'd arrive that day and so on. And you would load the cattle on to the wagons and they would head to Christchurch to add it to market. Now, another short historic thing which I think is worth mentioning about the early days of Mount White with the cattle. There were a lot of cattle out at Lochinvar in the very early days, and I'm not sure, but I think Cattle Creek got its name from the fact that there were cattle there. They were wild cattle. People used to go and shoot them, couldn't get them out of the bush, and they were mad as snakes. There was a man called John Cox in 1867. He went up the whole river with his wife and a couple of wee billy bits, and he knocked up a bit of a shack there in the scrub, Bull Creek, round about there. And then eventually got a few sheep and a few cattle, and he was going to make a name for himself as a backcountry fellow. And he had 1 or 2 dairy cows, so I understand. And it's been reported that he used to take dairy products on his back over the Danby Range to Harden, to spot or cattle, barley, to salt and flour, and necessary things that he wanted back at the camp up the Cox River. After a period of time there, of course, the snow got in and the cattle got away and couldn't control anything like that. Hell of a place to be. And so he pulled stumps. And I bet you found his wife thought, well, I'm getting out of this hellhole, take the wee kids and get away the hell out of this place. Snow and frost and rain and sleet and northwest winds, and oh man, they were tough people. But he went out and he eventually went and opened a butcher shop in Waikato, in North Canterbury. So that's just a wee bit of history that I think's worth mentioning. Yeah, Johnny Cox. Just a word or two about the good Hereford cattle that were run at Mount White. The cattle were driven out to Mount White Road, Riversdale, each year in preparation to being railed to the Addington market. When the cattle got to Riversdale, they were put in the big substantial cattle pens, and anything that had to be sorted out was sorted out at Riversdale. And the balance of them, of course, were taken across the Waimakere to the Cass railway station. This is one of the musterers, Jack Longley, sitting on the rail, nice cattle behind him. And the boys here, they're just getting the cattle through a gateway, nice and quietly, cows and calves, bringing them down into the pens. These are 2 big Hereford bulls that were Mount White. They look a bit wild and stuff like that, but generally they were pretty placid, not too much problem. The little calves had to be marked each year, of course, and these are some of the little calves that have just been earmarked and castrated, and sorting the cows and the calves out of the race and being drafted in the yards at Riversdale. And of course the cows and calves were rounded up with about 10 or 15 dogs, all barking and jumping up and down and having a great time. And of course then the boys were all standing up against the rail and leaning there and saying what a great job they'd done. We had a bit of a rodeo each year at Mount White, at Riversdale, and Sylvie Eaton, he liked to stand on the big bulls like this. He was the only one game enough to do it. And he used to win the calf riding championships every year because he was a duck jump riding champion. Ron, of course, he could hang on to the calves and ride them around a wee bit, but I'm afraid Murray Cagle, myself, as shows in this picture, we didn't ever win a prize. We always bit the dust. And finally, getting the cattle across the Poulter River to and from Riversdale or whatever you were doing took a lot of care, but with a bit of care and a bit of expertise and so forth, the cattle got across quite safely without any fatalities whatsoever. I want to talk briefly about an activity that took place at Mount White each year, and that is in regard to dehorning the adult cattle. The adult cattle at Mount White used to grow pretty good horns on them, Hereford cattle, and it was a matter of having to get the cattle into the yards and chop the horns off them. For a lot of people, they would think that this is a pretty cruel activity, but it had to be done for the safety of the workers on the place, and also the fact that working these cattle with horses, that a big cattle beast charging it with a horn sticking out of his head about a foot long, he could spear a horse without any problem at all, and then it was boot hill for the horse. So the easiest way was get them in, put them in a crush, and cut the horns off. Now, it worked that I sat up above the cattle beast in the race. They drove the cattle beast up, and I grabbed him with a big, like a bale and a cow bale, locked him behind the head, and they put a thing in his nostril called a sort of a twitchy thing, and they could control his head with that, and they would cut one horn off one side and pull his head round the other side and cut the other one off. They used to bleed a bit, blood had spurred up about a metre or something like that, but it was just something that you had to do. And we tried all sorts of things, disinfectant and stuff like that to put on, but too messy, waste of time, complete utter waste of time. Now, the law changed, and I suppose one could say for the better. People that did these jobs were competent, they knew what they were doing, and there was no cruelty in it, but of course the law changes, and it changes all manner of form. You can't cut the tail off a dog today, you can't castrate a cat, you can't do a lot of things. The time's going to come when you probably have to get a licence to cut your toenails. But I don't know if that'll happen, but it could happen. But anyway, the pictures that you're going to see about the dehorning, they look a bit cruel and a bit gruesome, but I can assure you that it was the best and the safest thing to do for the people and the horses at Mount White, and it was just something that we had to do, and we did it. These are just a couple of pictures of the dehorning of the cattle. The man is holding the bullock with the twitch in his nose, and the man now is putting the dehorners over the horn to cut it off. First he cuts the one side of the head off, then they throw the rope through to the man on the other side, and he pulls and puts pressure on the cattle beast's head to expose the big horn here, and he whacks that one off too. These cattle were a bit reluctant to get this job done, but it had to be done. It made it safe for everybody. And of course, silly me stood in the paddock when they'd done this old one, and it made a beeline for me and whistled past about an inch or two from my head, so I was pretty lucky that day.